War II, Kim Il-sung took power within North Korea, and he not only cemented his authority there within a very short space of time, he created a cult of personality. And say, unlike Mao, he didn't lead his armies to victory, and say, unlike Hitler, he wasn't a public figure. Beforehand, in fact, he was a relative unknown. While some people in Manchuria knew him, after all, he left Korea when he was pretty young, and in fact spoke very bad Korean. But anyway, he led a small army against the Japanese, but his political party that he started, the Down with Imperialism Union, had relatively little influence. So he wasn't even the main choice to become the leader of North Korea. Most Soviet advisors preferred somebody like Cho Man-sik, who was already a popular resistance leader within Pyongyang, but he was stubborn in his policies and unlikely to really work alongside the Soviets. Or you had somebody like, let me get this right, Park Hong-yong. Now, he was one of the founders of the Korean Communist Party, but he was part of the Yan'an faction who were aligned with the Chinese. So Kim was only leader by default, but many foreign people criticized the state he developed. For instance, in later years, Hoxha of Albania criticized his cult of personality, and earlier than that, in 1956, he was invited to Moscow to get a bit of a dressing down. And while he was there, the Yan'an faction, the pro-Chinese faction, planned to remove him from power. Of course, they were caught, and most of the pro-Soviet and pro-Chinese factions within Korea were purged. So that's one way Kim managed to secure power. So you see there that within 10 years, he managed to create a cult of personality that worried the Soviet Union. And 10 years is a very short space of time, so he didn't have long enough to indoctrinate the youth. This is mainly adults, that he's convinced that he's the right leader. And I think it's very important to say that comparatively very few people were purged, say compared to the Soviet Union or even Mongolia. So, and still today, in fact, many defectors still return. So, how did Kim manage to persuade the Korean population that he was the right ruler? So, of course, this is just me theorizing and rambling about what I think, but one thing that Kim did straight away was set up a government arm of art. And within just a few years, they filled Korea full with this art, and it was standardized within a very short space of time. In fact, art could no longer be produced to entertain, it had to serve a purpose. And of course, one of the things that they often displayed is Kim as a revolutionary leader. So of course he was portrayed as having a much more influential role in the struggle against the Japanese than what he actually did. But I think it's important to say that not many people could challenge this view. After all, not many people knew what he did during the war, so they could just take it as truth. Otherwise, another thing that he created was a sense of nationalism that wasn't really there in Korea beforehand, but he created a very peculiar sense of nationalism. He, of course, portrayed Korea as a racially pure nation, but he also portrayed them as vulnerable to outside powers in particular, and that they needed more of a mother figure. They needed a mother figure to look after them, and Kim filled that role, and it's apparent in a lot of the art that is produced. But to enforce this nationalism, he brought back old myths. For instance, Dong-gung, the mythical founder of Korea, was brought back in art after not really being featured in art for a few centuries. But a lot of the influences he found from Japan. Now, he's often portrayed similar to the Japanese emperor, like on a white horse and the likes. But for instance, Mount Paktu in North Korea, a previously insignificant mountain, became semi-sacred, very similar to Mount Fuji. Now, this is not really a shock. After all, let me get this right, Ri Seung-gi, he was a doctor who was educated in Japan, and many others like him were instrumental in the founding of North Korea. Now, I should add here that one reason why I think Korea was so susceptible to forming this cult of personality is, of course, its history. After all, in Asia, there's a long history of revering emperors and leaders as sort of semi-god figures, the Chinese, Japanese emperors and the Korean kings in the past. But there's also the geographic isolation and essentially racial hegemony that, say, somewhere like Nazi Germany or fascist Italy didn't have. So I'd say that's one reason why Korea could foment this cult of personality, whereas other nations couldn't. However, one reason I think Kim was particularly successful is that he portrayed himself as everything and was influenced by a great deal. And this was particularly important in Korea because Korea, like most places, was very divided at the time. They had anarchists, communists, Japanese collaborators, monarchists, a lot of religions and the likes. So he managed to play off a great deal of ideas and managed to portray himself as the only leader they should have. I've mentioned his influences from Japan and his creation of nationalism, but he also portrayed himself as a communist leader. He took a lot of influences from other more successful communist leaders. For instance, Stalin's 5-year plan became Kim's 7-year plan, and Mao's Long March became Kim's Arduous March, and even the creation of Juche you can see is essentially his version, his nationalist version of pretty much Maoism, I would say. Also, Kim was probably raised a Christian, so a lot of people have drawn parallels between, say, Kim's cult of personality and, say, Jesus. So you can see that there's the semi-miraculous birth of his son, the fact he still rules after his death. He's often portrayed as like a sort of humanitarian feeder, similar to Jesus, but he also has been influenced a great deal by old Confucian ideas, and is able to play on the old Confucian ideas of respecting the state, the family, the leader, and is often speaks about Korea as a family and himself as a mother or father of Korea. And by tearing down all the old religious institutions and buildings, he was able to present himself as the replacement. Now, he plays off a number of ideas when he talks about Juche, so he's both a nationalist and an internationalist, but I spoke about that in another video. But anyway, Kim filled Korea filled with art, portraying himself as a heroic general, a communist revolutionary, an emperor, a mother figure, a humanitarian, a religious figure, etc, etc, etc. So, in a Korea that was devastated by, first of all, Japanese occupation and then the Korean Civil War, he was able to portray himself as the leader that anybody wanted. Whereas, say, somebody like Hitler or Mussolini or Stalin only portrayed themselves in a very specific way and only appealed to a small section of the population at large, Kim appealed to all Koreans.